Hey, welcome to Ed, a podcast about the teaching life. This is Conversation 65, and I am your host, Shane Lawrence. Ed is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network powered by ATB. And this week I am joined by PhD candidate and teacher Jacinta Yanders.
It's optimistic for a Monday.
Well, yeah, but it's over. It's over. My kids are gone. I'm good.
That's true.
Not that I don't love them. But,
Sure.
you know, the pace does tend to slow a little when they walk out the door. So,
Absolutely.
well, I'm glad we found each other. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Jacinta.
No problem.
Right on. Am I saying your name right, Jacinta?
Yep.
And last name Yanders?
Mm-hmm.
Right on. Okay, cool. No surprises. The last guy I had on here, he had a Turkish name, and I mangled it all over the place. So,
You handle that much better than most people. I get called everything except Jacinta.
really, what do people call you? Like, how do you mess that up?
I get a lot of like Jacintas
Wow.
and Jacintas and Janitas and occasionally like Juanita or something that is a completely different name.
That's awesome. That's really creative anyway. You know?
Yeah. At like at coffee shops and whatnot, they usually don't even attempt. They just sort of look around and call out the drink sort of thing.
You know, my favorite stupid trick to do at coffee shops is I tell them my name is Heyu, Heyyou, and then I don't answer until they say it really loud. And so that's my fun little joke that I do to amuse myself.
Yeah, if I get the choice, I usually just give them like the initial J. But one of the ones on campus, it like takes the name from your card, so then it's just a mess.
Well, speaking of a campus, why don't we can we just dive right into this?
Sure.
So let's just start with you mentioned you're on campus, so let's just talk about what's your role in the educational world right now? Like, what do you do?
So I am a PhD candidate at Ohio State. And so as part of that, I teach one class per semester. I teach in the English department, and I teach one class a semester. Usually, well, in our department, we cover a lot of subjects. So my specialties, my areas of study are television, film, and pop culture. But I've taught composition classes, film studies. I'm teaching intro to pop culture this semester. I've taught digital media composing. So I've taught a range of things while I've been here. And then, so that's what I'm doing right now. My undergrad degree is in English education. So I previously taught in secondary as well.
So what got you moving from the secondary education into like the PhD realm? What pushed you in that way?
It was a few different things. One was I've always been pretty much always sure that I was going to teach in some capacity. When I was a lot younger, I thought it was going to be elementary school, and then when I got maybe around high school or so, I sort of settled on English because that was the subject I gravitated toward the most. And so I got my undergrad degree in English education, but I came out of undergrad in 2010, and it was very hard to get a job around that time in English education. Did a lot of applications for those 2 years and didn't get a lot of results from it. I did do some substitute teaching that first year. But after that, on the second year, I was out of undergrad. I did get a job teaching middle school. And while I do love like middle school students in general, I was not great at teaching middle school. I had worked primarily with high school students beforehand, and I was, I think, a little bit better at that. There was just some specific particularities of teaching middle school that I wasn't quite prepared for, I feel like. And I was also young and brand new and didn't fully know what I was doing. So it was a bit of a rough year for me in a lot of ways. Loved my students, but just I had a hard time a lot of that year I was teaching middle school. And leading up, going into that, I had also always thought that at some point I was going to get a master's degree in either either something else English or possibly education. I had considered getting like a Master of Arts in teaching,
Hmm.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So as I was doing that, I was thinking about the master's degree, and there were some other familial things going on that
Mm.
led me to the school that I ended up applying to for their English graduate program.
Yeah.
And so after I did that 1 year of teaching middle school, I decided to go ahead and enroll in that program. And I didn't really have aspirations to teach in higher ed before that point,
Hmm.
and I didn't really have aspirations to get the PhD either at that point. But part of that master's degree program was to teach 2 freshman composition classes per semester.
Okay.
And so that's what I did for the duration of that 2 year program.
Mhm.
And when I was doing that, I kind of found, for me personally in my teaching, I really felt like that is where I fit the most as a teacher. I obviously had done some work with other grade levels before, in my training in undergrad and in my subbing and then in teaching middle school. But the freshman of college really clicked with me, I guess. Something
Right.
really just set in. And then I also really liked the research that I was doing or starting to do.
Hmm.
About halfway through that program is when I really started to shift into media studies, which is what I do now.
Hmm.
So all of that sort of dovetailed together, and then I decided to go ahead and start looking at PhD programs,
Hmm.
which I applied to during my second year in the MA, and that more or less is how I got to where I am.
That's quite the road. That's quite the road. But uh, now, okay, you talk a lot about sort of, not a lot, but you mentioned sort of middle school peculiarities and then how you were drawn more to like freshman college. So what is it about the students? I mean, because that seems to be what it always boils down to is it's the kids, you know? What is it about the students that attracts you in one place to one place or another?
I
Like, what are you
think
looking for? Yeah.
with teaching middle school, I don't think I was just fully prepared at the time, for the mix of emotions and the
Yeah. Okay.
mix of
Yeah.
sort of the requirements of like the broader education system.
Hmm.
Um, I had, like I said, I'd obviously been trained in certain things, but this was about 2011, so there was a lot of testing that we were really getting into, which I
Right.
had some reservations about, but which was required. And so there was that, and there was just like I didn't feel fully prepared to uh, manage that classroom effectively,
Hmm.
which now, after much more teaching, I think I would have a better grasp on that than I did
Right.
at the time. Like I said, I was brand new that first year, and I didn't know so much. There's so much that I didn't know. Is basically the gist of it
Yeah.
now, and that's even with training. I kind of and knowing that there are people who are sent in classrooms sometimes without any training
Yeah.
scares me a little bit. But
Yeah.
but even so, like, yeah, even with training, I know that I wasn't fully prepared. I
Mhm.
also think that there's just something about different people that click better with different groups. I know
Yeah.
people who teach middle school who are like great at it.
Mhm.
They excel at it. That's their group. They are awesome at it. Same thing for people who teach high school or people who teach, pre-K or whatever the case may be. There's
Mhm.
something I think that sometimes just works more for different people in particular groups. And that doesn't mean you can't necessarily teach across groups. Like I know people have gone back and forth between, say, high
Mhm.
school and higher ed or middle school and high school, or whatever the case may be. But I do think sometimes there's some sort of like conglomeration that comes together when you
Yeah.
you get with particular ranges.
Yeah, there's certain that kind of intangible element about, yeah, you can sort of spot someone and kind of where they fit. Like, yeah, I know like elementary teachers, you can kind of spot them from a mile away. They just kind of have that the bubbly, they're just looking for a pair of scissors and some glue so they can do some crafts and stuff. Like, I don't know. I'm probably pigeonholing a lot of people and making people angry, but that's okay. Um,
That
I don't know. But yeah, I agree with you. Like I'm not that person either. Like I could never manage the elementary thing. But so what is it about college? Because what is it that you feel like you have or that you need to kind of be in that space?
Um, I don't know if it's any one thing. I do sort of like there's and I mean this does vary depending on department and school, but I feel like there is a lot more flexibility in
Hmm.
higher ed as far as what you can do in the classroom, and things you can tap into. And there's obviously not as much, generally not as much, oh, enforced testing in individual classes, right? Like programs might have a particular test that you have to pass at a certain point, but
Hmm.
it's not, built into every class in that way.
Yeah.
So I do like a lot of the flexibility. I do like a lot of being able to deep dive into certain things because a
Yeah.
lot of times, if you're doing secondary classes, obviously you're sort of doing broader sweeps through some of the subject matter, and sometimes in my college classes I can zero in on things a little bit more. Also, they're adults, so generally there's a broader range of things that maybe you couldn't cover in secondary classes that you can get into in college classes. Well,
Yeah.
you can get into with less backlash, I should say, because you could
uh,
still get into them in secondary classes, but the response might be different.
yeah. Well, then you got kids going home talking to parents, and then you're not just dealing with the students, right? You're dealing with the students' parents, and
Right.
yeah, and you got a whole other ball of wax to deal with. It's just so much fun. Um, is it so teaching in college? I kind of want to try and unpack this a little bit more because it is a different world than certainly what I'm used to, and probably what most people who listen to the show are listening to. So, I mean, here's my experience. Typically speaking, a lot of my professors were, when it came down to, pretty crappy teachers. And I'm so how do you have that stigma? I guess first of all, in the States, is that a thing that you have to fight against or deal with, or is that just up
Uh,
here? Because I mean, there's not a lot of
well,
training for university professors. It's just you know how to do
sure.
the genetics thing, so you teach genetics.
Yeah, and this is actually, I mean, this is a small personal, um, and it's not just me. There's a lot of professors who have a take issue with the lack of training that often happens pedagogically in higher ed.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I'm not a fan of that. As I just said, like going into teaching middle school, even with training, I struggled that first year. So when people, even in higher ed, go into teaching college classes with either no training or minimal training,
yeah,
because often programs you might have one class that you take at some point, usually in your first semester of teaching,
mm,
that does provide some sort of training. That I do think that is sort of setting people up to struggle in
mm,
ways that are unnecessary, but I don't know that there's an easy fix to it. There's multiple levels of changes that would have to happen in university systems and college systems to actually build in pedagogical training into
yeah,
graduate programs. And some programs have done that. Some programs do have, say, like teaching practicums in the semester before you're supposed to teach,
mm,
shadowing, things like that. But I don't think that that's typically the norm. In most cases, you might get like a little orientation before the semester starts, maybe a couple days or a week or two, and then you might get some training during that first semester, and then it's more or less up to you to either figure it out on your own or to reach out to other resources. So, like on our campus, we do have a teaching and learning center
mm,
that does provide resources if people seek them out, and they do events and things like that.
yeah.
Um, and that they do have those on some campuses, so that's available. But it is something that you would have to seek out. It's not necessarily built into the programs.
Right. So then, okay. So, hmm. How do you approach your teaching? Like, what is your overall kind of idiom, if you will, for teaching?
I mean, So this has grown a lot over the years. It's developed through the various experiences at the different levels and the different programs, with the different subject matter. For me, teaching, I really look at teaching as a collaboration with the students. And that's something that's developed more in recent semesters. It's not just me imparting information. I try to do a lot of discussion, a lot of interactivity,
Hmm.
a lot of response, reflection, those sorts of things. Um, Analysis is what I try to weave through all of my classes, regardless of whether it's composition or literature or a media studies class, whatever the case may be. So we
Okay.
often do written analysis. We might do um, small group work with analysis. We do things on the board. We do a mix of things. Um, I'm not particularly a lecture heavy sort of instructor.
Hmm.
Um, and some people are, and that's just not my particular mode. I do some of it, but usually not like a full class session or something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's I spend a lot of time thinking about teaching, a lot of time in the sort of planning process before the semester starts.
Yeah.
So I can, have some ideas before we jump in to the actual semester. I usually have some sort of theme or broad idea of what I'm trying to weave into the class, depending on
Yeah.
what kind of class it is.
Okay. Okay. And you teach primarily, you're leaning towards like TV, pop culture, film studies, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, so it's a couple things.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm in an English department. So if you're in an English department, most often what you are assigned to teach generally is composition classes. So I
Okay.
have a lot of experience in teaching composition classes, which is fine. I have almost 3 degrees in English. I do a lot of writing. I like thinking about writing. I like talking about writing.
Yeah.
And I do enjoy composition classes. As teaching. In terms of my research, it is the film, media studies, pop culture sort of stuff. And I've done intro to film, and I'm currently doing intro to pop culture,
Mhm.
and I've done a second year composition class, which was about documentaries. So that kind of bridged the two sections together,
Mm.
because I had my media studies and my composition teaching. So I've covered a lot of ground in my time here, which is sort of the function of a huge department. Like the English department at Ohio State is
Uh-huh.
quite large. So we have a range of things that we can do, and a fair amount of opportunities for different things that we can teach while we're here.
That's nice. You got a lot of flexibility that way, kind of like what you're talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay, so I've been kind of holding myself back a little bit here because I also teach film studies
Mm-hmm.
here at my school. And okay, so you talk a lot about analysis, and that's a big
Mm-hmm.
thing for your students. I think that's great. And I mean, for myself, like I love picking things apart. I can't. The thing is, I can't really explain why, and I struggle with this with my students because
Mm-hmm.
to me the benefit is simply in the action of taking things apart and seeking that understanding. But I mean, how do you sell that to your students? I mean, I'm sure you've got, for the large part, you probably got some pretty motivated kids who want to be there, young adults, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, what to you is the benefit of that analysis, like taking apart pop culture and film? What's the plus for you? All right, so we're going to get down and dirty with some film analysis in just a second here. But first, I want to tell you about another podcast called Back to School Again. It's a podcast about people who've made the decision in midlife to return to school, either to pursue a new type of career, to augment their current career, or just for the sheer challenge of learning something new. It chronicles the personal journey of host Katrina Ingram, who is back in school after more than 2 decades away. And each episode features a conversation with a wide range of midlife learners who are currently enrolled in post-secondary studies or have recently completed a post-secondary degree. The podcast is available now in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcatchers. You can also find the episodes and the show notes at backtoschoolagain.ca. Back to School Again is presented by Norquest College and is an affiliated member of the Alberta Podcast Network. Find it and our other affiliates at albertapodcastnetwork.com. All right, let's get back to the show. So I mean, what to you is the benefit of that analysis? It's like taking apart pop culture and film. What's the plus for you?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the specific class because certain classes have particular goals or objectives that we're working on, which might be part of the general education requirements or specific goals that I've come up with or goals that the students are interested in, depending on the class. But on a sort of fundamental level, often whether it's film or TV or music or a book or whatever the thing is that we're analyzing, I often sell it to them, first of all, with analysis as a skill that they already have, that they already use, that they just don't necessarily think about that the fact that they already have it and use it, so that we're building on something they already have. It's something that they can use regardless of what job or future endeavors they go into. But also these things that we're analyzing are factors in broader cultural context besides the classroom, right? So if we're analyzing a movie, my class this semester, we started with 2 horror movies, Halloween and Scream 2. And
Scream 2?
Yeah, specifically.
That is very specific.
We talked about the movies, in terms of their content, but we also talked about some of the things, what's the music signaling, what are the facts of who's being killed and why, and what do those tell us about contemporary thoughts at the time, and how do we understand those currently, right now. What do we think about what the director said in this way, and how do we connect that to what we saw in them? Which are not, not things that, they're things that anybody could theoretically do. They just happen to be in my class, and I'm requiring them to do it.
Yeah.
And so, but we think about those things for texts that they wouldn't necessarily have maybe analyzed otherwise that explicitly. But once they actually get started, I mean, in most of my experiences, they get right to it pretty well.
Yeah. So is the analysis of pop culture, is the attraction just because we tend not to think about it, just treat it as entertainment? Is that kind of what draws you in?
I think that's part of it, for at least for some of pop culture, because, for example, in these last couple of weeks, we've been talking about taste. And some of what we talked about with taste is like what kinds of things get critical acclaim, what kinds of things are marked as good taste or bad taste, what gets considered highbrow or lowbrow, and what does that tell us about how we think about socioeconomic status and race and class and gender and so on and so forth. So I often, when I'm talking to them about these things, we talk about how these seemingly, entertainment-centric artifacts or what have you, these things that we don't necessarily think of as being big fundamental cultural markers or what have you, that they actually are a lot of how we come to understand these different identities, different aspects of culture. We come to understand informed thoughts about politics, and not just that those texts are reflecting our beliefs, but they're actually helping to shape those beliefs and values.
Brilliant. I'm going to take this section of our conversation and just going to play it back for my kids next semester and be like, okay, kids, listen to this.
Very good. I support it.
Yeah. Well, I love that though, because I mean, one of the things I'd love to do, it will never work in my world that I'm in, but I would love to just do an entire semester just on Marvel films, for a lot of the reasons that you're talking about, because it is such even just from the beginning of the start of the MCU until now, it's like, it's been such a rapid shift in just the ideas that are in the films and just how they're presented. Yeah. So I would love to see something like that, but, or do something like that. But that would be.
Yeah. I've seen where people have done like a class on Marvel. I haven't gotten to a place where I can do necessarily that specific of a class just yet.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I probably could work my way into it, but
Oh yeah.
I haven't done one that narrowed. But I've seen some syllabi for that, and
Hmm.
yeah, there's a lot there that you can work with. Of course, there's like 20 films now, and I don't know how many
Yeah.
TV shows, so you'd
It's a
have
lot to
to
chew on.
really
Yeah.
decide what you're going to focus on, because there's so much there.
Oh yeah. I say it's in very immediate danger of becoming hopelessly bloated, but I don't know. Anyway, we can tackle that later, perhaps.
Sure.
Uh, Total side note: have you, just because you were talking about horror and whatnot, and have you seen Behind the Mask, the
I
rise
have
of?
not.
Oh my gosh, you got to go watch it.
All right.
The whole title is Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon. It was a little sort of
Okay.
indie movie. It's part mockumentary, part full horror
Mm,
film, and
okay.
it's a very conscious deconstruction of the horror genre, about
Okay.
a guy named Leslie Vernon who's trying to become sort of the next Mike Myers or Freddy or whatever. And
All right.
it takes place in a, in the real world, quote unquote, where these people are actually real and, have since retired. And so anyways,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great movie, great movie. So I haven't seen it for a very long time, but anyway, yeah. Sorry, I could just talk movies all day now, but that's probably not helpful.
Yeah, I mean that's what I spend a lot of my time
Oh,
doing.
but isn't that great? What a great job, right? You get to do that for
I
a job.
Yeah, that's one of those things though. That was never something I considered before I actually started grad school. I didn't really think of that as a real possibility, and then I got to
Mhm.
grad school and realized that there were actual programs where people did this for a living, and then realized that I could actually do it, and then decided to go and do it.
Yeah, you can actually talk about TV and pop culture. What was that moment like for you? Like, how did you figure out that, wait a minute, I can talk about TV and movies for a job?
It actually came by way of a literary theory class,
Okay.
which is
Okay.
funny in retrospect. But
Yeah.
I had a literary theory class, and our final paper the assignment was to go and find a call for papers for a conference or an academic journal, anyone that we were interested in, and write a paper as though we were going to send it in to that call,
Hmm.
and we had to use some literary theory in the paper that we wrote. And so I found a call for paper for I think it was the either the Midwest Modern Language Association or the Midwest Pop Culture Association conference. And in that specific call, they wanted something about television remakes, which is not something I had written about before, but it was something that I had been interested in for a
Hmm.
while, just as a viewer. So I decided to write about that. I wrote about Girl Meets World, which had just been like announced around that time, and that was when I figured out that, oh, there are people doing this thing, and I could actually keep doing this elsewhere and continue on from here.
Sweet, sweet. Well, it sounds like you found like a very happy place to land, career wise
Yeah,
speaking.
yeah. I mean, I like it. Like I said, I like teaching composition. I like teaching media studies. I like teaching them both together. Oftentimes, even my composition classes, at least here at Ohio State, we they tend to be theme classes. So I've done first year composition with a theme of gender and pop culture, and then I did another section with the theme of representations of food in culture. So I still tend to mix the two of them together.
Sweet. Sorry, my brain just kind of smashed into itself. This happens a lot.
It is late in the day.
Sure, we'll go with that. That's my excuse. I like it.
Sure.
It's only 4 o'clock for me. I got hours to go. Hours before bedtime. Oh, I got to pull myself together. Here's the thing. Hey, so this thought just kind of hit me just now. I mean,
Hmm.
every now and then I come across these articles about, how public education is failing, and how, increasingly professors are seeing these kids coming into university and they're not ready. Part A, are you seeing that? And part B, what do you want to see in students coming into your classes out of, say, grade 12?
What I my answer to both of them sort of is that I think that there needs to be more interaction between K-12 and higher education.
Huh.
in general. I follow a lot of K-12 teachers on social media sites.
Hmm.
I interact with a lot of K-12 teachers. I obviously have that secondary background as well. And so this is for a lot of reasons. One is that I think that it's good to know what's happening um, with students before they come to higher ed
Hmm.
classrooms, but also because I think that a lot of the same activities, assignments, and resources are useful across the board between secondary and higher ed in particular. Um, and three is I just think like we need to be talking to each other. There's not enough conversation, I feel like, and there's ways that I feel like when we don't interact with each other, then it makes it easier to make judgments about what the other side is doing wrong,
Mm.
or judgments that the other side doesn't, you know what our experience is, and therefore, well, we don't like them or something like that, right? I think
Yeah.
that there definitely needs to be more conversation, because I don't think, when I think about the question of students not being prepared, I mean, I think that first of all, there's just a lot of variety in students, and it's not. Um, there's a lot of variety in school systems. There's a lot of structural questions and concerns that I might have that don't necessarily have to do with an individual student.
Hmm.
Um, or something that they could remedy as the individual student, or even in an individual, say, secondary class. Um, so I think that the questions that I have often are more in line with what are the systems that the students are coming from, rather than the specific classrooms or the specific teachers,
Hmm.
because I think that has more of an impact. As you know, I grew up in a town that has a struggling sort of public school system, and
Hmm.
so my mother, made a choice to put me in the private school, which was something that she was able to do with a lot of extra work. It took a lot to be able to do that,
Hmm.
because she wanted me to sort of have particular advantages that weren't going to be available in the public school system at the time where I
Right.
was from. But it's also something that I mean, I always have, as an adult, I have mixed feelings about, because I really want us to be able to resuscitate and rebuild and actually positively feed into struggling school systems. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen if people just take their kids out of those systems.
Yeah.
Um, and but I also know that, this isn't just something that people can do necessarily on a singular level. It has to be broad. It has to be something that involves multiple levels of government and institutions that maybe aren't invested in that kind of change.
What do you feel like are the sort of the keys then to saving public education?
Oh, I
Sorry, that's a
am
big question.
definitely, yeah. No, I mean, and I'm definitely not the expert on that. But I don't have children at this point. I would like to think that I would put them in whatever public school system wherever I end up living
Hmm.
when they do actually exist. Um, because I do think that that is an important good, not just for your own kids, right, but for other kids in the area, because supporting ambiguous you
Oh, yeah,
supporting
yeah, yeah.
that school system and that school is beneficial for a lot of people. So I would like to think that that would be, on an individual level. um, I also think obviously there's certain things that are likely in city governances, in state governances, school boards, city councils, those sorts of things, where people can make some sort of difference. But
Hmm.
I think also we know that there's, at least in the United States, right, there's broad federal concerns that are
Hmm.
involved with some of the struggles of the school system. And I'm not really sure exactly what changes need to happen there to better support the systems, but obviously there are changes that need to happen. And obviously these issues with school systems are also tangled up in other issues of class and race, and those sorts of things that oftentimes people aren't really necessarily willing to address directly, which
Hmm.
is a problem. So
Yeah, yeah.
there's that too.
Well, you mentioned that idea of, the ideas of class and race, and I mean, again, looking through your Twitter feed and the kind of things that you're retweeting and writing about. I mean, how do these sort of social issues impact you as an educator?
Oh, how indeed. I mean,
Another big question. Yeah.
yeah, it's hard. I I think there's a few different ways that people can go is with these sorts of things and teaching. For me, it's very hard to separate out, you know, broad scale identity and communal strife from me as teacher.
Hmm.
So usually those things are all with me all the time. Um, in when I'm teaching, I, you know, one of my one of my things about teaching students how to sort of analyze and ask questions is not just so uh, I'm not interested in creating parrots that just say what I say, but I
Hmm.
do want them to ask questions about things that they may not have asked questions about otherwise. There's a lot that happens, I think, culturally that we often sort of just accept if we're not pushed to think about it and question it and sort of look at the context and the history. So
Hmm.
that's a lot of how I approach things in my teaching. That often is said in this way of asking questions about what these systems are, how they're operating, where the power is, who is holding the power, how they're choosing to use it. In that
Hmm.
documentary class I taught, the theme of the class was documenting crime, power, and justice in the United States. So we looked at a lot of different crime related documentaries.
Hmm.
Um, and we ended with the OJ documentary series that
Oh,
came
okay.
out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So we were looking at different ways that people um, obviously commit crimes in the United States, but also how those crimes are prosecuted. Was the public perception of different crimes or criminal, or whose behaviors are criminalized and whose aren't, and those sorts of things. So the part of the goal, as much as we have this idea of this sort of vague idea of what critical thinking is I mean I really do want students to think critically about things, media they consume, about text they interact with, and about those sort of news stories that might they might come into contact with. And ideally, regardless of whatever specific topic it is or whatever the specific class is, you know they practice some of those skills throughout the semester.
Wow. I have so much more I want to ask you. I feel like we're just getting going. Wow.
I
Oh.
I I I spend so much time like thinking about teaching just in general, even beyond specific classes that I'm teaching, because I don't think that education is necessarily a specific path to, I don't know, freedom or enlightenment or what have you. But I do think that it can potentially help people to develop some really useful skills for being humans in the world, which is, I think, something important to do.
I love the way you phrase that. Absolutely. That is such a perfect encapsulation of what education is about. Beautiful. Um, Before we go, because we are going to, I have to wrap things up here pretty quickly.
No, it's fine.
So yeah, I'm sure you're just like, yes, finally, I can, this guy leave me alone. But I'd be remiss to not mention your podcast. You have a podcast that you do.
Yeah, yeah. So I, again, in this pop culture nerdery that I do,
Uh huh.
I and three other academics we have a podcast called That Bleeping Podcast, which we just thought it was a good name. It's primarily focused on analyzing Degrassi, The Next Generation, which I feel like as a Canadian, you have to be familiar with Degrassi.
Now, see, I'm familiar. I'm a terrible Canadian though, because I never got into Degrassi. Well, it kind of missed me. Like the first generation, I was too young for, and the next generation, I was I'd get it kind of passed me by, or I'd passed it by. So
I see.
I don't like Rush. I'm not that into maple syrup. I'm a really crappy Canadian.
How do you feel about poutine, though?
Okay, I love poutine. Poutine.
Okay, great.
So
I went to Canada for the first time earlier this year. So
yeah. Oh, there you go.
Living my best, like vaguely stereotypical Canadian life while I was there.
Poutine is a great stereotype to indulge in. Absolutely.
So yeah, we primarily talk about Degrassi, The Next Generation, and we do like two Degrassi episodes per podcast episode. But we also have and we just we do a recap, but then we sort of analyze the episodes. Two of us on the podcast have watched Degrassi before, and two haven't. So it's like a interesting interaction between those of us who are seeing the episodes for the first time and those who had never seen it before. But then we also do episodes about other random pop culture things that we analyze. So we did an episode about The Craft, and we did an episode about Can't Hardly Wait, and so on and so forth. A lot of 90s pop culture nerdery specifically.
Fantastic. Well, it's a good listen. I've been listening to a couple of the episodes. Really enjoying them so far.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So, okay, before we sign off here, what's the best way that people can get a hold of you? Or what are the ways that people can get a hold of you?
Well, so I'm on Twitter, which is at Learn Teach Win, which is just that's been my Twitter handle for the longest, and I don't foresee it changing anytime soon. And then I also have a website, a blog that I mostly talk about both being a grad student and teaching. So the website is it's a WordPress site, so it's teach2learntoteach.wordpress.com. Teach to learn to teach.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and both of those, and there's, if you do go to the Twitter site, the blog is linked there on the sidebar.
Perfect. Well, Jacinta, thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. I've really appreciated having you here and just having this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
All righty. Well, you take care, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
All
right. Bye. All right, and if you want to get in touch, you want to be a guest on the show, you can email me at theedpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter at theedpodcast. This week, Ed is brought to you by LitFest Alberta. It's Canada's first and only non-fiction festival. It runs October 11th to the 21st and features dozens of events with writers from across the country and beyond, all sharing true stories and big ideas about culture, food, science, politics, and more. Among the writers are award-winning poet Billy Ray Belcourt, Rachel Giza, author of Boys, What It Means to Become a Man, and Dr. Brian Goldman of CBC Radio's White Coat, Black Art. To find out who else is going to be there, you can go to litfestalberta.org. Festival passes are only $129, and 4-packs and single tickets will also be available. You can get $5 off just by using the promo code APNROCKS. Get your tickets today at litfestalberta.org. And if you want to listen to more of Ed, you can head over to the website, theedpodcast.podbean.com, or you can find us on Apple Podcasts. Just search up Ed Conversations. Ed, as you may know, is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network powered by ATB. Ed is also heard on Voice Ed Radio, which is 24-hour internet broadcasting devoted to the best ideas in education. Just head over to voiced.ca. So, on behalf of myself and Jacinta, thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.